All right, well, we're going to get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrea Sampson. I'm the CEO of Talk Boutique and your host and moderator of today's Sense Making Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, since the murder of George Floyd in May, we've all had the opportunity to examine our own beliefs and actions and to decide what each of us can do to make the world just a little bit kinder and more inclusive. Personally, I've really reflected on my own complicity and how I can do better. What I realized is that I've allowed a lack of knowledge, of understanding, and particularly of language to keep me from being a strong ally to my fellow humans whose skin looks a little different from mine. I've always, and it's been really important to me, to be a strong advocate for women in leadership. But the truth is, I didn't bring that same passion to race and color discrimination. I simply didn't take the time to truly understand. And over the past few months, I have had many, many conversations, and I'm grateful to those who have helped me to understand. And in particular to our own John Robinson Jr., who's on our team and who hosts our weekly Courageous Conversations. He's been a fantastic teacher and sounding board for me as I've navigated this difficult topic on how I can best be an ally. These are difficult conversations, and they're ones that many people aren't comfortable actually having. So I'm hoping that today we can start this conversation with a little bit more comfort for many people. I've learned, from those that I've spoken with, that one of the first places when we are having these difficult conversations is to start in examining the language we use, and specifically the implication of our words. Language is powerful, and yet we go along with what's comfortable or popular. Words like diversity, equity, inclusion, they're used without deep thought as to how they might be impacting our thinking. Language is something our guest today thinks a lot about. Parul Bansal is an urban strategist, journalist, and poet. She uses storytelling and experience design to bring forward difficult conversations and unpack complex systems. Parul holds a Bachelor of Science from McMaster University, a postgraduate certification in negotiation from Harvard University, and a fellowship in journalism from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Policy at the University of Toronto. She has practical experience in and is an eternal student of the behavioral and emotional responses to language and process. In fact, uncovering the emotions that sit beneath deep ideologies and behavior, I would say, is Parul's obsession. At the center of her work, she questions how we can serve the human spirit better and deeply believes unity is plurality. She's an artist, and her poetry and multi-sensory experiences are inspirational and are meant to jar us out of our comfortable places. She uses housing, art, and technology as vehicles to demonstrate renewed perception of difference. She is currently a ferment artist in residence, where she uses her art practice to leverage tools of capitalism to imagine different results. Now, Parul, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about language over the last little while, and specifically the words and the concept of diversity and how this has impacted you throughout your life. I invited you here today to help me and to help our guests understand why this is so important to you and to all of us, and how we can all learn from your lived experience. Now, I know you've been working on something, and I can't wait to hear it because I have a feeling you probably have some poetry to share with us, which I love. But I'm figuratively going to step aside right now and let you take the floor. Parul, join us.
I thought I'd get right into it. I have a confession to share with you. I was a product of society. I was manufactured. I remember when I was a little kid trying to wash the brownness off of my skin in hopes to be beautiful. I was told by everyone around me and my family that being fair, being whiter was better. I even tried to whitewash my personality to be like what was modeled around me. Let's be clear. This isn't a story about me. This is a story that people who look like me experience. We were manufactured by two very opposing forces, by Western ideologies and Eastern culture. You know, personally, it led me to feel a lot of friction in my being. To be manufactured by Western society that I was raised in, you know, to be honest, primarily white people who told me how to be brown, in contrast to my family and the molding and shaping that they impressed upon me and their idea of what it means to be a brown femme. At one point in my life, I remember feeling really, really flustered. I actually really struggled to make decisions at that time. I found myself making decisions that weren't mine, and to be honest, I didn't want. I tried to follow what I felt like I was supposed to do. And things generally imploded in one way or another in that moment or later. And here I am. You know, there was this particular moment. It was November 2014. It was the opposite of today. It was pretty dark and stormy evening here in Toronto. And I met my brother at a bar. I was telling him about these contrasting values that I felt. You know, the values that my family gave me and the values that were shown to me by society. You know, I felt literally like this friction, this heat in my body by trying to live these two very opposing value sets. So I self-imposed a journey of deconstruction. You know, I didn't, and I do not want to be a subject of what others told me to be. And to be quite honest, I am still on this journey, and it is non-linear. And you know what? It is so much bigger than me. It is steeped in historical context. You know, it brought me to this particular understanding that the idea of diversity is both a fallacy and an illusion. You know, to be honest, it's straight up harmful and untrue, in my opinion. The idea of diversity insinuates that there's a default group, aka white people, and everyone else as an other. And let's be real, there are more colored bodies in the world than there are white bodies. And diversity, I mean, it just feels like another form of othering. It's an example of Western or white supremacy that's stripping us of our differences. And that intersectionality, that beautiful intersectionality that every human embodies. So today, I'd like to talk to all of you about remembering the power of your individuality. That by breaking through these oppressive states that have us asking for permission, we can start to create a future where there is no othering, where we can show up exactly as we are. You know, it's like walking through a forest and seeing all of these beautiful shades of green. You know, those shades work together and it feels magical. I know you know what I mean. And maybe you have a favorite. Maybe you love lime green or forest green, but nonetheless, you know that it's the orchestra of these colors that really bring this beauty together. So let's break this down together. You know, I firmly believe that as we claim our powers as an individual, we get to go and be separate from the masses. You know, you get to know where you start and where you end. To be truly and to feel truly like an individual. You know, choosing how you show up in the world aligned with your values. And it's not easy. It's not easy to live in alignment with your values. It requires a lot of self-confrontation and a lot of self-interrogation. But I also need to recognize the privilege in what I'm saying. You know, the privilege to feel safe and be safe in self-expression. You know, when systems are made to protect you, but they work against you, it's difficult to self-express. And we are seeing some of that loud and clear today all over the world. So on my journey of deconstruction, I thought to go back to my ancestral lands. You know, I thought it would help me remember who and how I am. You know, at some point it felt kind of like a book that was written, you know, that journey, that classic journey of going on like a who am I moment. And it felt important to me. So I went to India last December. I felt surprisingly at home once I arrived. I was so welcomed. And I met and observed so many beautiful people there, just wonderful humans. And I couldn't help but notice something. I noticed that there was this fixation that the West is best, that Westernized values were so sought after. And I was really taken aback. You know, to be on the other side of the world, in the epicenter of my culture, and still feel the potency of, you know, Western society infiltrating India's rich culture. You know, I'm having a hard time saying this because, to be honest, it felt violating. And then I took a step back and recalled India's history. Conquered, a statement of superiority, ignorant power, full of ego, the fundamentals of colonization. For to colonize is to occupy a space because you can and you want to, then to discard it as if it were nothing. This creates a fracture in humanity. Like how Britain colonized India, extracting India's culture, precious stones and spices. The only outcome was butter chicken and chai lattes, a wasted effort, and generations of Indians impacted. Forceful messaging passed down through brute force, ancestral trauma. And my culture, my understanding of self, colonized, diluted, polluted with notions of white is best. Our identities are being compressed, so let's not assume that the West is best. Let me tell you, history helps you remember your strength. And remembering your strength, your history, will help you unravel your beautiful self. It is a challenging and journeyous experience, but you know, once you get to see the brightness of who you are, people can't help but notice. You know, when you are an individual, you allow me to do the same. You give others permission to be their whole damn self, and you give yourself and others power by showing up this way. I truly believe that. I believe that your individuality is our collective power. And that to me is truly remarkable. Simply put, each person living their full life, truly living it, inspires all of us to do the same. And to reclaim our individuality, I mean, it's a process, and I'm sure you can imagine. It's a process of growth, of unlearning and uncovering who you are, because to be quite frank, we have forgotten because of these oppressive states that we have been burdened with. You know, oppression has become accepted. In fact, it's become expected. It's kept us rooted in the same damn place, that place of sameness. And somehow we think that's the goal. Especially given the climate of what we're seeing in the world right now, of what we're seeing in North America, we are really getting to see the impacts of these oppressive states on people. You know, COVID has driven us to see this. The Black Lives Matter movement has shown us this. What we're seeing in India, in Brazil, in so many places and spaces, we are seeing these oppressive states come forward into the mainstream conversation. You know, at some point in my life, I forgot what color I was when I walked into a room because I assimilated so goddamn well. You know, my mom even gave me a white middle name. It's Jennifer. That middle name is to protect me from racists, to help me assimilate when I need shelter. For me, Assimilation, it meant washing away pieces of myself, pieces that I didn't even get a chance to know, and parts of me that I thought surely wouldn't fit in. Maybe you know what I mean. You know, I pressed those parts of me down so deeply that I actually forgot they even existed. I mean, I'm Westernized. Can't you hear it in my voice? Assimilation. It collapses one's sense of worth to the weight of external pressure. It bleeds so deep, it becomes unconscious. Microaggressions to ourselves, to each other, as our unconscious has been colonized into submission. Should is a sharp word. Its jagged edges are of oppression, assimilation. And assimilation, it pushes us deeper into the habits of hurt, anxiety, lack of sobriety, till finally it becomes us. Our behaviors, our thoughts, molded by this facade. That place of sameness, the whitewashedness, disabling our spirit, oppress, suppress. Conformity provokes separation of oneself, of the other, segregation. This is when we let the story become life. Allow ourselves into the ether, take no control. We fall into a cycle, unconscious patterns as we fracture our being. Fractured beings from other fractured beings as they seek to find the light in a place that feels dark. You know, here are the steps that I've uncovered. Conforming to the system requires you to oppress yourself. As you oppress yourself, you push some of the best parts deep inside you, and you limit your creativity, your imagination, your possibility of the future. It essentially strips down the human spirit, leaving you to be a shell of a person, slightly robotic, walking through society. I am asking for us to actively, individually and collectively, unlearn these oppressive thought patterns that are keeping us separate from ourselves, that are segregating us from each other. You know, I believe that when we do this, we're able to understand, we're able to create this beautiful sense of belonging amongst disparate and different individuals. You know, we get to create a space, we get to hold a space where your whole self, your whole damn self is welcome. You know, diversity isn't enough. It sets up judgment, that there's a majority and there's an other. What I believe we really need is that we really need to see plurality of humanity. You know, like I mentioned before, there is an inherent default to the idea of diversity. You know, there's a comparison that needs to happen. And in this moment, the default, and for the last several years, decades, centuries, the default has been straight white people. And the others, well, they're people of color. They're people that live on the spectrum of genders and sexualities, amongst other differences that don't fit into this small box. In contrast, plurality starts from a place without comparison. It indicates plentifulness, and there is no baseline. Kind of like shades of green in a forest. Speaking of shades, I remember being a little girl who wanted to wash her skin, all the brown off her skin. What I didn't know in that moment was that I was internalizing colorism. You know, colorism is discrimination based on skin color. It's a form of prejudice, and it is enforced by Western beauty standards. As a little kid, what I was essentially doing was reversing that hatred back onto myself. Later in life, I learned that so many brown-skinned folks shared that feeling. And the fact that we've all been there and felt that shame, to me, is quite disturbing. It makes me feel quite sad. Yet all the shades of skin color, like shades of green in a forest, they too can be remarkable. We can choose. We can choose to let go of categorization, and we can start to recognize that we are so complex and each of us are so individual. You know, belonging to yourself. You are a sovereign person. You create your own identity, thereby your own reality. This is your life. No one can override it. Not your love, not your family, not your mission. They will all have a place with you, but they will not occupy all of you. Unity is plurality. Reduction of complexity creates levels of singularity. The illusion of simplicity, layers stacking so high, instability, and we wonder why. When the mix could be so fruitful, so delicious, wrapping us in one another in the multiple futures that truly can exist. You know, plurality and belonging means your individuality is celebrated. It is welcomed without the burden of oppression, without the burden of should. We can feel that power of our creativity once we let these go. We can feel the power of our imagination. And our differences can finally be celebrated, acknowledged, and expected. We don't have to be products of society. We don't have to wash ourselves of our color, of our cultures, and our uniqueness. You know, I'd really love for us to remember the power of our individuality. And with this power, we can break through oppressive states that have us asking for permission. You know, again, we can create this future where there is no othering, and when plurality is like shades of green in a forest. When we look at the world through the lens of plurality, we allow options and new frameworks to exist. We can celebrate the individual, the different, and feel that unity in our difference. Feel our imagination grow and our ideas for the future truly expand.
I feel like I need to stand up and give you a standing ovation. That was incredible. I know I speak on behalf of our guests when I say thank you for sharing such well thought through ideas. These are big thoughts. These are not easy thoughts. And they are not comfortable thoughts for many of us. And I appreciate the work that you've done to get to this place and to help us to see the power that we can all have when we think just a little bit differently. And in fact, come back to that concept of the language that we use. Your poetry is absolutely stunning. So thank you for sharing it all peppered throughout. There's some notes coming up from our guests thanking you, so you might want to take a moment and just have a look. What I want to talk about, though, as we kind of go a little bit deeper, and I'm left with a couple of questions, and I want to remind our guests to post their questions as well. But I'm going to start off with a couple. You know, I personally hate labels. I'm a woman with, you know, purple hair and crazy glasses. And, you know, I don't see myself on, you know, in terms of the color of my skin, but yet the world does. And the reality is I am a white woman, and with it comes a certain amount of privilege. And I recognize and acknowledge that. And it's something, again, that I'm learning how to understand and to be more generous, perhaps, with what it is that I do. And I heard you talk about plurality versus diversity, the concept that diversity has a group who are a default, and that everyone else is sort of in addition to that, whereas plurality is open. And I guess I'm left with the question of, does it include me as a white woman? Does it include white men? What does that look like, and how do we get there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And thanks for all these comments. Lovely humans, for being here. Um, I appreciate your attention. So yes, the answer is, if I could say this, like, fuck yes, you are included in this. You are absolutely included. The idea of plurality is truly that there is no other, that we take away the idea of this default, that we take away the idea of, you know, giving one person precedence over another, and everybody gets to be included. And, you know, I would argue that you are more than your skin color, Andrea. You have more intersectionalities behind what we see. And, you know, I think that's important to recognize, is the nuance of each person. And some of those intersectionalities, like, for example, a person could be white presenting, but also queer. And that intersectionality of queerness is a challenging one according to mainstream society. And so I don't want to diminish anybody's full being, because, you know, there's so much more behind the skin color that we see. And beyond that, you know, the spectrums of white, just as the spectrums of brown, are plentiful. You know, I recall being on a video chat about anti-racism, and everyone on the call presented white, except for myself. And we went around and we shared our lineage, our stories. Where did we come from? What is our origin story? And despite everyone on the call presenting white, as in having white skin, everyone had a very different background. Everyone had a very different ancestral history and different degrees of ancestral trauma associated to that. And I think that's really important to mention before we're quick to judge, hey, you white person over there, or hey, you whatever person over there, to really acknowledge the nuance and the history that you can't see.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, because you know, and I hear so many conversations right now on the concept of diversity, and to your point, the idea that we are one thing is such a fiction, really. We're never one thing. And so I'm loving this idea of plurality that just opens it up and allows for us all to sit. And, you know, these are difficult conversations that we're having, and we don't have language for them. There, you know, the reality is there are words that we have to use that are uncomfortable because we've been taught that they're derogatory or wrong or just simply inciting, and we have to learn a new language now. And, you know, diversity is one of those words that that I thought meant one thing. You've helped me to understand could in fact take us to a place that's not helpful. And so where did your thinking on this come from? How did you get to this place? Because I think it's so incredibly interesting.
Yeah, so actually it was in India. I was speaking at an event because, you know, as I mentioned, and as maybe folks all have also felt in their life, various points of friction, and that inability to really describe the nuances of themselves, the nuances of their existence. And I continuously felt like I was being put into a box. And I was like, where is the box exploding machine? Because I would like to fuck this box up, because I don't want it. I don't want to have to choose male or female. I don't want to have to choose what country I'm from. I don't want to have to feel like I'm stuck in these binaries. I don't want to have to choose, you know, all of these choices that we make every single day. Are you from the suburbs? Are you urban? You know, like, we consistently make these dualities. And I was reaching my peak frustration, and naturally, as you are just about to implode, sometimes the world gives you a little gift. And for me, I experienced that. I was actually in India. I was mentoring at an event hosted by this Barcelonan duo called I Am Internet. They're wonderful. If you have a chance, check them out. And Space 10. And we were imagining the future of Delhi a billion seconds ago, a billion seconds from now. And Space 10, if you're not familiar, is the design firm from IKEA. And so in that conversation, you know, the these two wonderful humans, these futurists, brought forward the language of unity and plurality amongst other language. And it really touched a deep chord in me. It wasn't new language to me. It was just a word that fit into a place that I was really seeking to understand, or to verbalize with more clarity outside of my being, you know. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and it actually is a really interesting question that just came through from one of our guests, Stephen Lytle. He talks about, he says, isn't plurality an idea that is further down the spectrum? What if the spectrum runs from racism to plurality and includes prejudice and diversity as different levels of the spectrum? And if so, isn't seeking plurality a giant leap beyond what we as society are ready for? Aren't there other steps along the way that should be considered first? Really thoughtful question. Thank you, Stephen. I'll leave that to you. That's a big one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And you know, Stephen, there's truth to that. Plurality is a big step forward. It's not the reality that's going to exist today, tomorrow, and definitely not next year. I'd like to say that it could possibly exist in my lifetime, but at the very least, I think we need to put the seedlings into the ground. We need to start nourishing these thoughts, because you're right, Stephen, like that this isn't the next step, right? This is the future. This is the perhaps idyllic or protopic future that we hope to embody. And I guess the reason why I bring it up now and here is because, you know, a lot of the work that I do, I choose to do because I'm fearful of the dystopic future that we're heading towards. I'm worried about all the limitations that we've put upon ourselves and what our ideas of the future could look like. And the premise of my talk, that wasn't so explicit, but the premise of my talk was to start imagining, step away from what we already know, the examples or the lanes of future that we believe exist, and start imagining radically different, perhaps even obscene futures. Because, you know, once you start imagining, it's not necessarily that dream or that imaginative scenario will come true, but there's a larger space for other things to exist in between what we see here and what we can imagine here. And we give ourselves that space for a larger number, ideally infinite numbers of possibilities that we can build towards. But like, you are absolutely right. You know, we have to be careful, and this is in you know, how we structure this, and it's going to take a lot of time. I would feel really grateful if it happened in my generation, but I think we need to start having these conversations about imagination and critical thought and critical analysis of the words that we use, which are subtle nudges to the realities that we dream of.
Yeah.
So
I think
that would be.
I think what you bring up is such an important point, which is, you know, if we are aiming for diversity, which, as Stephen points out, is maybe perhaps a stop along the way, you know, and it's like anything. If we're aiming for that, we'll get close to it, but not quite there, because that's kind of the way it usually works. And we might achieve diversity, maybe. But if that's all we're aiming for, that's probably where we'll get to. Whereas, to your point, if we're aiming for plurality, which takes us far beyond, and there probably are many other stops along the way, diversity being one of them. So it's not that, and I think what I maybe want to bring up for you is that diversity isn't a bad thing. It's just not enough. And so plurality is perhaps the place that we all should be aiming for. And diversity is a stop along the way, as Stephen points out. Yeah. There's another question from Kevin, and I love this question too. He grew up in Toronto, and he said, for the most part, all I knew of my Canadian upbringing was my Canadian upbringing, and I feel more white than I do Korean, which is my background. How would you suggest I begin to unlearn my white biases?
Kevin. I really appreciate that question. Obviously, you know, I've went on my own journey of discovering. Where to start? Okay, so I'll share some anecdotes, and Kevin, hopefully some of these resonate with you. But there are always things that maybe your family or your grandparents or something in and around your Korean culture that they say, and you brush it off. You're like, no, that's like not cool. That's not something I'm interested in. That's archaic. That's traditional. That's something or another. It's not resonating. I would say that all of those moments, what I was actually doing, and it sounds like maybe what you're doing as both of us growing up and whitewashing ourselves, is what we're in fact doing is reverse racism towards ourselves and towards our own culture. And I would pause. I have paused, and I started listening. I was like, okay, Mom, tell me more. I want to know more. Can I speak to this uncle that has more information about this? And I'm starting to get curious about something that's not cool, maybe, according to mainstream culture, because I want to know. And to be honest, Kevin, it took some pieces of my culture being co-opted or culturally appropriated by mainstream society for me to feel violated. I was like, whoa, you're having your golden milk turmeric latte? I was like, I grew up on that stuff. There's no fucking way I'm paying $6 for that when my mom would make me that at night when I was feeling like when I wasn't feeling well, and she would just bring that cup to my bed, and I'd have milk with turmeric and a little bit of sugar and ginger in it. And that's a home remedy. And then it became popularized, and then I started feeling offended. And so I think I would love for younger me, for you, Kevin, for anyone, before it becomes popular and mainstream, to get curious and get into your beautiful, rich, and loving culture and start experiencing that. And anytime you feel resistance, ask yourself why. And ask yourself, hey, is this my resistance, or is this what I've been programmed to feel because of the inherent white and Western biases that I've so deeply internalized? And the last thing I would say is, anyone going through this journey, be kind. Be really kind to yourself. This is hard, and we don't even know how deep it goes. It's really hard to imagine.
I love that example you gave of the turmeric latte, because it hits home in a certain way, in that, I think we all grew up with, those things that we just took for granted as being the loving gestures of our family, of our mothers, of our grandmothers, of those who loved us. And so, and they're little, they're all little, just things that, that we always thought were unique to us. And I can only imagine how, the things that my family did, to be suddenly see them at Starbucks, it would feel really invasive and unfair. And so, not to say that things can't become mainstream, but to your point, get curious about that. Like, like the fact that it was a home remedy, like even as Starbucks maybe puts it on their menu, maybe they can explain that. So if we think about brands or companies that are in this conversation, it's having cultural sensitivities of not doing it because, look, a turmeric latte is delicious, and all of us can probably benefit in some way or another from learning about some of these things, but understanding where they came from and having the stories that go along with them. I can, like, it would help me. So when I see it on a menu, or I stumble upon it in a store, I have the context to say, I'm making a choice that this is something that was a beloved custom for somebody, and so I'm going to take it on with a sacredness, and not just with I'm going to put my $6 down and get a plastic cup and off I go. And I think that's go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, beyond that, also, like, who's capitalizing off of tradition, off of someone else's kind of home remedies, let's call it, right? And is that money actually going back to the place where it was originated? In a capitalist society, how do we, that exchange, that also feels invasive. There's the knowledge and the experience, but then the labor and the profit. Um,
so it's sharing the story, but it's also sharing in the commercialization, like the culture itself that's coming from should be recognized. And I think there's so many, like we're talking about so many big concepts right now, and they're, it takes me to the place of kind of taking Stephen's question earlier, and I think we just answered the question that he's just asked, which was around the idea of commercialization. But where I think this takes me is, well, then how do we start to implement a pluralistic approach? And what's the first steps? Because diversity seems a little easier. Like we can talk about like looking around and seeing a diversity of faces. That seems at least an easier step. But in a pluralistic approach, what does that look like? What is the first step?
It's a beautiful and important question. And gosh, it's one that I think a lot about. I think it goes, there's many first steps, right? Like, there's so many places to start because there's no map, right? Like, where do you enter when you don't have a map? You don't know where the entrance is. Personally, there are two things that kind of go hand in hand with plurality. And I think touching on the questions that we've received so far, they've kind of circled around this answer here. And the first one is around your individual self. Really understanding where you've come from, your ancestral being, like understanding you and how you became to be, asking yourself these questions. It feels really important to self-interrogate and to understand, some of the ancestral trauma or some of the beautiful things that have been passed on to you. Because to take that time to do that, not only do you feel the richness within yourself, but through that richness, you'll change the lens in which you see the world, and you'll start to see richness in others. And you'll see richness in other cultures, imagining that they too have a full body experience. And, parallel to that, without doing that work as an individual, it's really hard to provoke change because you need to feel it, you need to embody it. But then at a systems level, with all those folks that did this work for themselves, I think simultaneously we can work on a systems level and be curious. Again, I'm going to say curiosity because, like it's been mentioned, this is quite far from our ideal state. But being curious, asking other people about their culture, learning about a thing as you consume or purchase it, being conscious about what you are choosing in your life. And, stepping away from duality, stepping away from this thinking, I remember when I was younger and not so long ago, I struggled. I was like, well, how can my artistic self like work alongside my strategist self? Like, how one's corporate and one's playful, or, however I felt it at the time. And to me, they felt like they were kind of like butting heads. But if you were to reframe that with the lens of plurality, you're like, that's not actually butting heads. They're actually nourishing one another. And so if we start like co-opting the idea of plurality in our own lives, I think personally, we'll feel less friction within ourselves. We'll see a larger spectrum of possibilities. We'll understand that a person is full-bodied in their experience. And, I don't mean to have this like optimistic or overly idealistic tone about it, but when it's as simple as starting with yourself, yeah, I could totally be optimistic about that because you have the agency to do that for yourself. Honestly, yourself is asking for it. And if you were to give that gift to yourself, I'm sure you would thank yourself and you would look at the world truly differently.
Parul, this has been a fascinating conversation. Our 45 minutes together has absolutely flown by, and we're actually a few minutes over. I completely lost track of time because this conversation is fascinating and important. But I want to thank you for allowing us to have this conversation, to delve deeply into it, and for being so incredibly kind as to share your thinking with us. I want to thank our guests who have stayed with us through this, and to remind you that we continue to have these conversations every week. Next week on Wednesday, July 15th, John Robinson Jr. will be having a courageous conversation with Chika Oruwu. Sorry, my pronunciation is always terrible. On anti-racism. And next Friday, July 17th, we will be looking at the intersection of art and science, making STEM become STEAM, with Anne Makoshinsky, who is a young inventor and who has been featured in many on many different talk shows, and she is just a fascinating young woman. I thank you all for staying with us. Parul, any parting words as we leave?
Just feel a lot of gratitude for everyone that was here and present. A lot of gratitude for you and having me here, and I hope I gave people some interesting thoughts to navigate themselves around. And however you take it, maybe it'll impact you today, tomorrow, in the future. I hope I left a little pebble of inspiration with you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we will see you next week.